Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave with Evil Eye Games. Today we're going to continue on with our 9th video in the series on creating a third-person cover shooter. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that I did in fact start a Facebook page. So if you're looking at getting updates via Facebook, you can go ahead. I'll leave the link down below. And let's get on with our video. So in the last video, we got a weapon that is firing projectiles, and right now it's really not much more than a toy gun with some flashy effects. So we're going to go ahead and make our weapon actually do some damage. But first, I want to go ahead and add a crosshair into the screen so that way it can help us aim and test things out. So in our main content folder, I'm going to right click and we're going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this HUD. I'm going to open up our HUD folder. I'm going to right click. We're going to create a new blueprint class. And in all classes, I'm going to search for HUD. I'll select that. And I'm going to name this 3P underscore Player HUD. Then I'm going to right click in the folder. And I'm going to go to User Interface, and I'm going to create a widget blueprint. And we're going to call this Gameplay Widget. Now, what I'm going to do with these is the widgets are going to contain the images and information that we want to display on the screen. And then I'm going to use the HUD blueprint to control which widgets are on the screen at a given time. So we'll go in and we'll open up our gameplay widget. And in the palette here, I'm going to search for image. Now we're only going to be making a very basic crosshair so we can test out. So I'm going to drag 4 of these images into our canvas panel. I'm going to select the first image, and in the details pane, I'm going to name it Crosshair Up. I'm going to select the anchor to anchor it to the middle of the screen. I'm going to set our X position as 0. I'm going to set our Y position to -35. I'm going to set our X size to 4 and our size Y to 25. And then for the alignment for X, I'm going to set it at 0.5. And this will create a nice vertical line just above the center. So I'm going to select our second image. I'm going to call this one Crosshair Down. Once again, I'm going to set the anchor to the center. Our position on X is going to be 0. Our position on Y is going to be it's going to be +10. Our size on the X is going to be 4. Our size on Y is going to be 25. And the alignment on the X is going to be 0.5. Next, I'm going to select our third image. We're going to call this one Crosshair Left. We're going to select the anchor to the center once again. Now our position on the X is going to be -35. Our position on Y is going to be 0. The size of X is going to be 25. And the size of Y is going to be 4. And then the Y alignment, I'm going to set to 0.5. And then finally, for the last image, we're going to call it Crosshair Right. I'm going to, once again, anchor it to the center of the screen. Our position X is going to be +10. Our position Y is going to be 0. The size X is going to be 25. The size Y is going to be 4. And our alignment on the Y is going to be 0.5. So if we click on our screen, we have a nice little basic crosshair here. And we can definitely use that to test where we're aiming and how the projectile is firing. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and save this. And we can go ahead and close out our gameplay widget. Next, we're going to go into our Player HUD, and we're going to go to the event graph. Now, I'm going to get rid of these other two events because we're only going to be using the begin play. And from begin play, I'm going to drag off, and we're going to search for create widget. And then we're going to select the class for the widget, which is going to be our gameplay widget. And then I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we're going to call this gameplay widget class. Next, we're going to need a reference to our player controller. So I'm going to right click. We're going to do get player controller. And we're going to go ahead and plug that into our owning player. So now we have this widget on the screen. I'm going to right click on a return value and promote to a variable. And this is the reference to the actual widget. So we're going to call this gameplay widget. And then finally, we're going to need to add our widget to our screen. So from gameplay widget, I'm going to drag off. And we're going to search for add to viewport. And that's all we're going to need to do here. So we're going to go ahead and compile and save and close out of our HUD. Lastly, to get this working, we're going to need to go into our game files. And we're going to need to go into our game mode blueprint. And under HUD class, we're going to need to set it to our 3-player HUD. So we can go ahead and compile and save, close that. And if we go ahead and hit play, we now have a white crosshair on the screen. And if we fire our weapon, it shoots straight at the center of that crosshair. So the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to create an interface to transfer information between our projectile and the target that it hits. So I'm going to go into interfaces. We're going to right click, go to blueprints, and select blueprint interface. And I'm going to call this damage interface. And we'll go ahead and open up our damage interface. And we'll be faced with a new function. And I'm going to call this one take damage. Now we're going to need some inputs. So I'm going to create a first new input. And I'm going to call this damage min. And it's going to be of type float. Create a second input. And I'm going to call this damage max. And what I'm doing with these two is I want to create a minimum and maximum damage for our weapon. So there's a little bit of randomness in there. Not too much, but we'll get to that when we actually calculate the damage. Next, I want to implement a system for taking critical damage. So I'm going to create a float called crit chance. And this is going to be a value out of 100 that will basically determine the percentage of shots that are going to critical. Next, I'm going to add a new input. And we're going to call this one hit bone name. And then for the variable type, we're going to select a name. And when we actually get into implementing this, I'll show you exactly what this is going to pick up and what it's going to do. And lastly, we want to add a final input that is going to be called damage Instigator. And this is going to be of a type actor. So an actor reference. At this point, we can go ahead and compile and save, and we can close out of our damage interface. Next, we're going to go into our weapons folder and into our projectiles. We're going to open up our base projectile blueprint. Now, first, we're going to go to our class settings. And under interfaces, we're going to go ahead and hit add. And we're going to add our damage interface. And if we can compile it, we can now have access to our damage interface. one thing I want to check before we go on is in our collision settings, I was playing around with this, and I just want to make sure that you guys have the same options that I do. So for our collision preset, we're using custom. For collision enabled, I set it to query and physics. For the object type, I set it to our custom created weapons channel. And then all of the settings for the collision responses are set to block, except for our traces and our weapons channel. So that being set, we can now go ahead and implement our interface. Now, in our break hit result here, we have an option for hit actor. So that's going to tell us the actor that the projectile collided with. And the first thing we want to do is we want to check to make sure it actually implements the interface we're using. So I'm going to drag off of hit actor here, and we're going to search for does implement interface. And then for the interface type here, we're going to search for damage, and we're going to find our damage interface. And I'm going to grab this destroy actor at the very end of our execution chain. I'm going to give us some room. And then for this does implement interface, we're going to add in a branch. And we'll hook up our does implement interface to that branch. And now if our hit actor does implement this interface, we can go ahead and call on that interface. So from our hit actor reference, I'm going to drag out, and we're going to search for that take damage function. And we want to send a message to the other object, so we're going to take the take damage message. And we'll go ahead and plug that into our true from the branch. And then we're going to have some information that we're going to need to supply to the interface about what we're sending it. So there is a damage min, a damage max, our crit chance, the hit bow name, and the damage instigator. So for the damage min, I'm going to go ahead and right click on it and promote to variable. And we're going to call this damage min. Then for our damage max, I'm going to do the same thing, promote it to a variable, and call it damage max. Lastly, I'm going to do it once more for our crit chance. Promote it to a variable, and we'll call it crit chance. So we have our 3 weapon stats here that are going to be in variables. Then we need our hit bone name. So going back to our break hit result, we have one pin that is hit bone name. And we're going to drag this out, and I'm going to connect it to our hit bone name. And what this is doing is it is going to name whatever bone in the object that it collides with. So in our static mesh, when it collides with that static mesh, it's going to hit a specific bone on the mesh, and then it's going to return to us the name of that bone. And what we can use that for is to determine different damages based on bone names. And lastly, there's the item of the damage instigator here. Now, we're going to go ahead and pass our damage instigator down from our character, who is going to be the actual damage instigator. It's going to pass it down to the weapon, and the weapon is going to pass it down to the projectile. So, I'm going to right click, and we're going to get Instigator. And this will return whatever actor is the damage instigator for this actor. And then finally, we can drag our destroy actor back over, plug that in, and I'm going to make a copy. And we're going to plug our false into the copy of the destroy actor. And lastly, in our base projectile, we are going to have to set the values of this damage min, damage max, and crit chance. Now, I want the values to be held in the weapon itself, so I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call this one set damage info. And we're going to add in 3 new inputs. All 3 are going to be floats. And they're going to be the 3 values that we need to set. So we'll have damage min, damage max, and finally crit chance. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our 3 variables from our variable pane. And we'll just connect them up accordingly. And then, of course, I'll just use a couple of reroute nodes to make it look nice so it's easy to read. And at this point, we can compile and save. And we'll go back to our content browser. And we're going to go into our player weapons. And we're going to open up our base weapon blueprint. Now, on our fire weapon chain here, we come to the point where we spawn the projectile actor. And there's the pin to set the instigator for that actor class. So we're going to go ahead once again and right click, and we're going to get instigator. And we're going to go ahead and plug that into our instigator pin. Next, we're going to have to call in that function to set our damage info. So we're going to search for set damage info, and we'll call that function. And I'm going to take these 3 values, and I'm going to promote them to variables for our damage min, our damage max, and finally our crit chance. Now we're storing the variables inside of our weapon. So at this point we can compile and save. And then we can go ahead and set the values for our base weapon. Now I want the base weapon to start out at, well, we can change this later, but I'm going to start out around 10. And really you shouldn't have much more of a variation in your weapon. More than like a 20% variation at most. So I'm going to set the minimum value to 8, the maximum value to 10. And then for a crit chance, I'm going to give it a, for starters, we'll try out a 10% crit chance. So we'll go ahead and compile and save that. Next, I am going to go back to our content browser. We're going to go to our characters folder and our player character. And we're going to open up our 3P player character. Now, at the point where we spawn the actor for our weapon, we want to set the instigator. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to search for self, because our character is going to be the instigator for all this, and plug it in. So when we spawn the weapon, we set the weapon's instigator to our character blueprint. When our weapon spawns a projectile, it will send that instigator information to the projectile. So we can go ahead and compile and save. And while we're in our player character, we might as well go ahead and add the interface for our damage, because we're eventually going to want to cause damage to our own character. So I'm going to go to class settings, and under implemented interfaces, we're going to go ahead and hit add, and we're going to add our damage interface. So we can now compile this, and then right click in our graph And we can search for take damage. And there's the event take damage. We now have an event, so if something comes into contact with us, we can go ahead and do whatever we need to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and save this for now, and I'm not going to deal with the player taking damage quite yet, but we are going to need something to damage. So we're going to go back to our Content Explorer, and in our Characters folder here, I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this Enemy Characters. So inside of our Enemy Characters folder, I'm going to right-click. We're going to create a new blueprint class, and it's going to be a character. And I'm going to call this Base Enemy Character. And we'll add a BP in there at the end for consistency's sake. And we'll go ahead and open up our Base Enemy Character blueprint. And we're going to go ahead and click on our mesh. And under mesh in the details pane, we're going to select the mannequin. And we're going to go ahead and drop them down. I think it was, 87 or 88 from our other character. That looks fine. We'll leave it for now. And we'll rotate him around so he faces his arrow. All right, so we can compile and save. And we're going to need to go first. I want to set some settings in our capsule component here. We're going to go to collision, and we're going to set a custom collision. And we want to make sure that our weapons do not interfere with the capsule. So I'm going to set the weapon trace to ignore, and I'm also going to set the weapon channel to ignore. And then in our mesh, we want to make sure that it is hitting on the weapon traces and the weapon channels. So first thing I want to do is simulation generate hit. We want to check this box so it's true. And for our collision presets, we're going to hit custom, and we're fine with query only, no physics collision. And we want to make sure that our weapon trace is blocking and that our weapon channel is blocking as well. Next, we're going to go into our event graph. And just before we do that, actually, I'm going to go into class settings, and we're going to add our interface. So we'll go ahead and click on add, select damage interface, and we'll compile it so we can access it. And I'm going to go ahead and right click in here, and we're going to search for that event take damage. Once again, we want the event. And we're going to have to do something with the health now. So in order to do that, we're going to have health variables. So in our variable section here, I'm going to add a new variable, and I'm going to call this one current health. And it's going to be of a type float. I'm going to add a second float. We're going to call this one max health. And finally, one third variable. I'm going to call this one is dead. And this is going to be of type Boolean. And at the event begin play, we are going to get our current health and set it. And then we're going to get our max health. And we're going to set our current health to our max health. So that's an easy way to make sure that when the character is spawned, it is going to be at maximum health, unless there's something very particular you're trying to do. So if we hit compile, we can then go ahead and set our max health variable. And I'm going to go with the generic 100. And then we're going to have to take on our event for taking damage. So in order to calculate the damage here, we're not going to need to know the damage instigator for now, but we are going to have to pull in these damage min, damage max, our crit chance, and the hit bow name. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call this function calculate health. And then we're going to have to set up our inputs to be those values that we need over here. So we're going to need a damage min input, a damage max, a crit chance, and the hit bone name. So we'll go ahead and add those. All right, so we have our damage min, our damage max, our crit chance, which are all floats, and then our bone name, which is a variable type name. So now we have access to all that information. What we're going to need to do is determine what our actual damage is going to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in the graph here, and I'm going to find random float in range. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a random number in between a minimum and a maximum. So we're going to plug our damage min into the minimum, and we're going to plug our damage max into the maximum. And then I want to promote this return value to a local variable, and we'll call this local damage. And we'll go ahead and connect our execution pin up. So now we have a number that's generated between 8 and 10, at least for our default settings. The next thing we have to do is figure out if we made a critical hit or not. So in order to figure out our critical chance, I'm going to actually copy this random float in range, and I'm going to paste it in place. And for the minimum value, we're going to set it to 0. For a maximum value, we're going to set it to 100. And then we want to check this random float against our crit chance. So from the return value, I'm going to go ahead and check if it is less than or equal to our crit chance. So if we have a 10% crit chance and our number is 10 or less, it's going to return a true, and we are going to be able to go from there as far as doing what we're going to do with our critical value. Now, in order to accomplish all this from our setting local damage, I'm going to go ahead and drag off the end of that, and I'm going to search for a sequence. And this is going to perform these pins in order from lowest value to highest value. And from the then 0, we're going to add in a branch. And our condition value is going to be the result of this random float in range. So we're going to go ahead and plug that in. Now, if we have criticaled, what we want to do is we want to take the local damage. So I'm going to go ahead and get it. We're going to multiply it. And then you can multiply it by whatever value you feel like critical damage should be. In this case, I'm going to double our damage. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our local damage to the return value. And we'll connect that into our true. Now, if we don't critical, we don't need to modify this number at all. So we're not going to hook anything into the false pin. Next, we're going to travel to our then 1 pin. And what we want to do at this point is we want to find out what bone we ended up hitting. So I'm going to drag off our bone name here, and I'm going to search for switch. And that's going to provide us with a switch on name. So what it's going to do is it's going to read the value of the name put in, and then based on what that name is, if it matches a list or not, it will do different things. And we'll connect our then 1 pin into this switch. And what I'm going to do for this value here is there is a default pin that comes with a switch, and I am just going to add another pin to it. And for this one, I'm going to type in head. Now, in order to discuss exactly what this is doing, I'm going to go back to our content browser, and we're going to go into our UE4 mannequin folder, and we're going to go into our mesh. And one of the items in here is the mannequin physics asset. I'm going to open that up. And one of the very nice things about the UE4 default mannequin is that the skeletal mesh collision is actually set up quite well. This was done pretty decently. One thing to keep in mind is if you're importing custom meshes for your characters, you're going to have to edit the physics asset for it. When you import a character in, it generates a default skeletal asset, but most of the time it just takes all of the bones and generates them, and it's total garbage. Like, it doesn't work very well. In this case, if I hit simulate, our character collapses to the ground, and he actually functions quite well. So if you drag him and drop him, he doesn't do any unnatural movement. And if you've seen any of those really crappy Steam games where the enemy gets hit and their head rolls across the floor, but there's this spaghetti strand between the head and the body or something along that lines, the reason is because they didn't set up the physics for their characters properly and then try to use ragdolls. Now we are going to go ahead and use ragdolls, and I'm not going to go ahead and do anything with this physics asset right now, but I will eventually be taking in custom meshes. So when that comes up, I'm going to go ahead and address how to configure your physics assets so that they ragdoll realistically. But what we're going to use this for right now is the physics collision of what our particle collides with, or our projectile collides with, is going to be one of these capsules that are on our physics asset. Now, when it hits it, it's going to draw the name of that physics asset, specifically the bone that's attached to that capsule, and it's going to return that name. So if we look at the skeleton here, I set the first option to be head, and there is a head bone within the skeletal mesh. So it's going to return that name head. You can actually do this for all of the bones in the character model and assign different variables or different values of damage that is done to each one. So you can pick up one for the arm, pick up one for a leg, or even break it down to an upper arm, a lower arm, a hand if you wanted, and have the torso be different. But in order to do that, one thing to keep aware of is when you're creating that switch here, the name has to be identical. So in this case, our head is in all lower cases. So if you were to add the torso here, we have the spine 1 and the spine 2. They have an underscore underneath them, and it's spine underscore 01. And then it has to be very specific. They have to match, they have to be case sensitive, and they have to be identical. If you don't, it's not going to register the name as being a match, and it's not going to react the way you want it to react. The other thing to note is in the hierarchy here, if you're ever wondering where exactly there is a physics asset, the bones that contain physics capsules or physics entities are going to be boldened. So we have our root, which is not bold, but our pelvis, and if we click on our pelvis, it highlights in orange the capsule here that is attached to that bone. Whereas if we click on our index finger, nothing highlights, there's no bones or no physic elements attached to those bones. The last thing to note here is when we're doing this and we're colliding with the mesh, this is completely dependent on the skeletal mesh structure. Now, you can bring in custom characters and you can re-rig a skeleton to an animation skeleton. But one thing to note is the animation skeleton is different from the skeletal mesh skeleton. So the bone structures can be completely different and named differently. So if you end up bringing in custom characters with custom done meshes, you're going to have to take a look in there and change up the name so that it is appropriate. Otherwise, once again, if it doesn't match exactly, it's not going to really work. So, from our switch on names here, all I really want to do is increase the damage in the event that there's a headshot. So if we click on the switch, to the right in pin options, there's the has a default pin. I'm going to uncheck that, because we only want to do something special in the event that we hit the head. So I'm going to actually copy up here the local damage, the multiplier, and the set local damage. And I'm going to paste it in place, and we're going to do the exact same thing. So we get to the first sequence, we're going to check to see if we have critical. If we have, we double the damage. Then we see if we hit the head. If we hit the head, we're going to once again double the damage. Now we've calculated all of our different damages, we're going to need to calculate our player's health. So I'm going to click on Add New Pin in our sequence. And we're going to have to go ahead and set our current health. So I'm going to drag that out and select Set. And we're going to connect our then to our set current health. And we want to set the health to our current health. So we'll get our current health variable. And we're going to subtract the local damage. So from our current health, I'll go ahead and search for minus. And we have a float minus a float. We'll connect our local damage to the other pin. And then we'll go ahead and plug that into our current health. So at this point, we're going to take the damage away from our current health. And then we finally want to check to see if our character is dead. So we're going to drag off from our current health. And we're going to go ahead and put in a branch. And the condition for this branch is going to be if our current health is less than or equal to 0. Now, if our current health is less than or equal to 0, we're going to go ahead and set our current health to 0, just in case it goes below 0 for some reason. So we do enough damage where it drops below the 0 threshold. And then we're going to want to go ahead and set is dead. And we're going to want to set is dead to true. So we're going to go ahead and compile and save this. And then for testing purposes, what I want to do is at the end of our chain here, but before we get to the branch, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag out and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print a string. And we're going to print our current health to the screen. So that way we can see if it's actually doing something. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and save. Then we're going to go back to our event graph here. And before we perform our function, I want to put in a branch. And we're going to, at this point, check to see if we're dead. And if you want, you can actually add this into this calculate health function as being one of the very first things that we're doing before we do any of this. So if you wanted, you can drag it into the actual calculate health function, which, you know what, I think I'm actually going to do. So I'm going to add this into our calculate health function. I'm going to drag this over a little bit. I'm going to pop in a branch here. and we're going to go ahead and check is dead. And then I'll just add in a few reroute nodes. And we'll go ahead and compile and save. And then back at our event graph, we'll get rid of this because we added it into the calculate health function. So we'll drag out our calculate health. And we'll connect our damage min, our damage max, crit chance, and the bow name. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and check is dead again. And we'll add in a branch. And if our character is dead, we want to, for now at least, we want to destroy actor. So we'll call the function destroy actor, and we want to destroy ourselves. So if we kill it, it's going to disappear. So let's go ahead and compile and save. And we'll go ahead and hit play. And we haven't added any characters in. So I'm going to go back to our content browser. And in our enemy characters, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag a couple of these guys out into the world. And we can go ahead and test it out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. So if we shoot this guy in the body, okay, so one minor correction. I originally set it to be as dead as true, then we're going to go ahead and calculate damage, which is obviously wrong. So I'm going to disconnect the true pin, and I'm going to connect the false pin into our local damage. So go ahead and compile and save, and we'll try it. So if we shoot at our guy, we're getting different values. And once we eliminate all of his health, he disappears. Now, the one thing you'll notice is because we're using floats and a random number generator, it's not going to come up in whole numbers. So to get the damage down to whole numbers, what we're going to do is, in between this random float in range and setting our local damage, is we are going to go ahead and drag off of here, and we're going to search for round. That's going to convert it into an integer, and then we're going to drag it and connect it into our set local damage, and it will provide us with a converter that will convert it back to a float. So it's a little bit of a way to get around it, a little bit messy, but it's nothing too terrible, and I can totally deal with that. And one other thing is, I want to know if we're actually performing a critical hit. So in the first checkup here, where we set the local damage after a crit, I'm going to add in a print. I'm going to add in a print string, and we're going to put in here, say, critical hit. And we'll go ahead and as well add another print string down here for a headshot, so we know we got a headshot. And we'll go ahead and compile and save, and we'll hit play. So if I shoot at his head, we have a registered headshot. And then let's see if we can get a critical around here somewhere. There we go. So that last hit there drew a critical hit. And luck would not be with me, apparently, because I can't draw another critical hit. But we know the critical hit is working, and we know the headshot is working, and we know the damage calculation is working correctly. So I'm going to get rid of these print strings and connect everything back up. And we'll compile and save everything. So right now we're just basically calculating our player's health from ranges of a couple of random numbers in between a range of a minimum damage and a maximum damage. And then we're calculating a possibility of a crit chance. And then we're also finding out if we have a headshot. And then if our character is dead, we're going to destroy the actor. I will be covering in future videos how to do something a little bit more fun. We are going to get into ragdolling the enemy characters. And I do want to use a dissolve function on the enemy character, so it looks like the enemy just kind of dissolves into air while burning up. And then we'll also address, after we start making our AI, on how to calculate the damage for our player character. It is going to be very similar to the way that the enemy calculates the damage. However, one thing I want to do is I'm probably going to take out the ability for the enemy to critical hit the player. And I'm going to add some incentives for the player to use cover. So if the player is taking cover, they're going to receive a damage reduction while they're in cover. And that's one of the things to think about when making a game, is when you want players to use certain mechanics, how can you get your players to use those specific mechanics? So that's going to complete today's video. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below. And of course, thanks for watching.